Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is another show-stopping performance by the incredible mind of James Williams, author of The Railroad Through Mad Ape Pass. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Stone Cold Killers, Part 3. Let's get straight into that. As Brian came to, backup entered the building. Seeing him on the floor, they rushed over to check on him, helping him to his feet. Other than the goose egg on the back of his head and the headache that came with it, he was fine. And that was more than could be said for Jones. Tilly wasn't the only one to lose their last meal at the sight of the rookie's body. Even a seasoned EMS worker couldn't stomach it. After being cleared by a paramedic, Brian started looking around for another body, that of the person he'd shot. In all, he'd fired 7 rounds at point-blank range, and he knew most, if not all of them, had hit the mark. What he found left him in confusion. There was no blood, just dirt, dust and pieces of flaked rock, as well as bullet fragments. It didn't make any sense. Did anyone see someone fleeing the scene or walking down the road? He asked, but everyone responded in a negative. Stepping outside, he looked around at all the blue and red flashing lights, and sitting in his squad car, he thought for a moment. The person he'd seen wasn't David, but at the same time, both murders took place in the same building, and so David had to be connected in some way. He decided to put a APB on him as being wanted for questioning, and then headed back to the station to give his statement and write up the report. David got an early start the next morning, gathering the supplies he would need for the hunt, and loaded his own shotgun with Gerald's iron shot rounds. I'm going to get going. The sooner I start looking, the sooner this is over, David said, shaking Gerald's hand. You be careful now and watch your back, Gerald said, pulling from the handshake as he sat back down in his chair. David nodded. Sure thing, he said, and headed out the door. With everything running through his mind, the drive back didn't seem to take so long. And seeing the police surrounding the warehouse, he'd figured something else must have happened. A lump formed in his throat from the guilt of another death, more blood being on his hands. There wasn't anything he could do about it now, and he sure couldn't pop in for a look around while the cops were there. And so he drove on, heading for town. He wouldn't go too far, though. Once the coast was clear, he'd go back and shoot that evil thing right in the face. Brian had been up the rest of the night giving his account of the incident and filling out the paperwork. His eyes hurt. He was tired. And the goose egg on the back of his head was so tender he couldn't wear his favourite ball cap. He walked down the steps of the police department to his car, idle-mindedly fiddling with the keys. He was very much ready to go home and try and sleep, until he looked up to see David's pickup parked at the diner just up the street. All elements vanished as Brian made his way over and inside, and seeing David sitting in the corner booth alone and away from the other patrons. He went over and slipped into the seat across from David, glaring at him. That's not polite to just... David started but was cut off. Shut up. Just shut up. Brian ordered in a hushed tone as he could manage. Someone was in your warehouse last night. They killed Jones and they nearly killed me. Why they didn't do I don't understand, because they had me dead to rights. Now what the hell is going on? Did you piss someone off or something? Tilly asked, still glaring at David, who didn't look surprised. Yeah, I saw the crowd out there. I figured something else happened. I'm sorry for your loss of your man, David said, looking down at his cup of coffee. I'll tell you everything I know, including what killed Officer Jones, but you're not going to believe me. he said, and proceeded to tell Tilly the whole story. He told him about them going to Gerald's yard, him still in the statue, what the book said and the video from the museum. He even told him about the old man blowing the head off the last remaining statue, and Brian just sat there and listened to every detail without saying a word. When David was finished, Brian continued to stare at him for a minute before pulling out his phone. Obviously, the loss of your brother has caused you to suffer some kind of mental break. If you let me, I'll get you the help you need. But if you think for a second that I'm going to believe any of that crap, you're crazier than you sound, he said, flipping his phone open. David reached across the table and closed the phone in Brian's hand. Before you ship me off to the nut house, give me a chance to prove it, he requested. And Brian sighed, putting the phone away. Fine, but only so I have more evidence to have you committed, Brian said, and David chuckled. Fair enough. Let's go to the warehouse. There might be clues to back up my story, he suggested, to which Brian reluctantly agreed. David grabbed the duffel bag from the back of his truck and followed Brian to his cruiser. The drive over was awkwardly silent. After the conversation at the diner, idle chit-chat, I just didn't seem to fit the situation. When they arrived, other investigators and lab techs were still there. Brian refused to let David bring his bag inside, since he had an idea of what might be inside. He had a quiet word with one of his fellow officers, and within a few minutes, the building was cleared, except for the two of them. Okay, walk me through it. What happened last night? David said once they were alone. Brian's patience was wearing thin. We came here because I thought you were breaking back in, and I had questions. The lights were off and the switches, they didn't work. I went up to turn on the breakers and sent Jones down the stacks to look around. Then I heard him scream. And Brian paused, clearing his throat. When he screamed, were the lights still off? David asked. Yeah. And then I hit the breaker and I went looking for him. This way. Brian pointed and led the way. I found his flashlight and hand here. The rest was over there. I heard footsteps over here and I went to see who it was. I saw a figure about 5'10", average build, walking towards the door. I told him to freeze, but he turned and then came running at me. I fired and I don't know, 7 or 8 rounds. He stopped, shaking his head. There's no way I missed, but he didn't go down. Hell, he never even flinched. Then I tripped and hit my head. The last thing I saw was him standing over me. David looked at the setup, noting of the claimed 7 to 8 rounds, only 3 were marked off as located. Looking around the floor, he noticed small chunks of stone and tiny bits of unrecovered bullet fragments. Well, you didn't miss, he said, pointing out the evidence. When you fell, you landed here? He asked, motioning to the area. Yeah, your point, Brian replied, still skeptical. You were in the light. I couldn't touch you. Well, it's probably still in here somewhere. If we find it, we can kill it, David suggested. Brian rubbed his temples. He was tired and had had just about enough of this psycho babble, yet something compelled him to give David the benefit of the doubt. Fine. But we're not smashing anything that could be viewed as evidence. If, and that's a big if, you can prove the statue is alive. I'll let you have at it. However, if you're wrong, you have to check into the mental ward for evaluation. Deal? Brian offered, to which David agreed. Joe Tillman was one of the town's many drunks. However, he was the most stable one of the bunch. Between benders, he kept up a small farm and sold fresh eggs and milk to supplement his retirement check. He rolled out of bed and put on his long johns to go fetch the hen's latest batch, as well as milking Betsy. Stepping out onto the porch, he blew out of each nostril and then spat on the ground before taking in the morning air. Looking up the road, he could see the police were back at the warehouse. What are them fruitcakes doing now? He thought to himself. Joe didn't really like the boys that much and hadn't heard about what had just happened to Mark. He figured their lifestyle had finally gotten them into trouble, but it wasn't any of his business. And picking up a pail and a basket, he headed for the barn. Halfway across the yard, he noticed how quiet it was. Far too quiet, considering the number of birds he had. He was concerned that none of the chickens were out pecking the yard, nor could he hear them inside clucking and clacking about. He finished clearing the yard a bit faster and opened the door. Inside, there were blood-stained feathers everywhere. "What in the hell?" he muttered. His first thought was a fox had gotten to them, but then he looked at the dirt leading to the door, and it was human-shaped feet. He also noticed that no prints were leading out. "All right, you little shit. When I find you, I'm gonna beat your ass black and blue," he said, and then strode on in. The big door remained open to allow in plenty of sunlight for him to see, as he made his way over to Betsy's pen. "You in here with my Betsy?" he asked, looking into her stall. And seeing the twisted mound of gore that was once his beloved cow made him stumble and fall back. What? He muttered, trying to process the gruesome sight. His face scrunched into a scowl of anger as he got to his feet. I'm gonna kill you now, you son of a bitch," he growled, having lost all sense of logic that he couldn't face whatever had torn apart a cow. And striding over to the door and putting it closed, locking it shut with a big iron bar through the handles and frame, and armed with a pitchfork and a little light from the upstairs window, Joe went hunting, jabbing at any mound of hay big enough to hide a person. He stepped onto the second-floor platform of the loft and was hit hard from one side. He flew into the outer wall and was slumped to the floor, gasping for air. His left arm was broken and dangling by his side, and he knew he had some cracked ribs. Looking over to where he'd been knocked away from, a figure was standing in the dark. After a moment, they started walking towards him, giving him little time to get to his feet. He lifted a pitchfork that was still clutched in his right hand and braced it against the wall. The steel prongs skipped along the stone surface before catching on a thin crack in the stone, causing them to bend. The handle was grabbed, snapped, and flung away in one motion, leaving Joe staring at the figure in shock and confusion. A pair of rock-hard hands grabbed him up like a ragdoll and began slamming him into the wall and floor. Joe screamed at first, but was soon unconscious and eventually dead. Blood dripped down the walls and ceiling as Joe's limp body was savagely torn to pieces. Before David and Brian could conduct their search, the CSI team needed to finish their job. Both men felt comfortable with letting them back in, but for different reasons. Brian figured it was all in David's head, while David knew the Stone Man wouldn't attack people that were in groups. They waited outside in awkward silence until the last of the techs cleared out and left so they could get started. "You got a shotgun?" David asked. "Why would I need—" "Oh, right," Brian replied, popping the trunk and getting out his police issue Remington 870. David reached into his duffel and pulled out his shotgun as well, and then handed Brian some shells he'd gotten from Gerald. "You'll need these. Solid iron shot," David said, and racked the pump action on his own weapon. Sure. Whatever," Brian said, swapping out his regular shells with the new ones. The two re-entered the building side by side. "So, what are we looking for?" Brian asked. "A statue," David replied. "No shit, Sherlock. What does it look like?" Brian scoffed. "We've had no other statues in storage. Nothing of that size, anyway. So, you'll know it when you see it. If you see it, shoot it," David replied. Without another word, they made their way through the stacks, staying in the light while checking each corner before moving on. They reached the back of the building without seeing it. "Flashlights," David suggested, and Brian nodded. And staying close together, they made sure there was nowhere the statue could hide. It was a long, grueling process, but they cleared the rest of the building without finding the stone figure. "So, are you going to come back quietly or kicking and screaming?" Brian said, clicking the safety on his weapon and then reaching for David's. "You said you were here at night, or maybe it left while you were unconscious," David said, refusing to hand over his weapon. "We had an agreement. If we didn't find your statue," Brian was saying, but was interrupted by a distant scream and thudding. They both turned in the direction they thought it came from, seeing a small farm in the distance. "Sounded like it came from old Joe's place," Brian said, clicking the safety back off. "Yeah, let's go check it out," David replied, putting his gun in the back seat of Brian's car, and Brian did the same, and they both got in the front. The drive over was a short one, and the two exited quickly, getting their weapons from the back, just like the storage building. They walked side by side towards the house. Finding it empty, they started for the barn, but were unable to open the big door. Brian raised the gun to shoot it open. "Whoa, what if Joe's in there? You might hit him," David pointed out. "Fine. Suggestions?" Brian asked. Hayloft door," David pointed out. Sure enough, on one side of the barn was a ladder leading up to the second-story door. The two of them slipped inside quietly and looked around. It was hard to see in the dark barn, with only a few small specks of light shining in. David turned on his flashlight and shone it around the level they were on and then to the floor below. When the beam passed over a detached human leg, he froze and nudged Brian. Seeing what David was pointing to, Brian's nose scrunched in disgust. Other body parts as well as the dead livestock could be seen strewn about the floor below. "It's here, all right," David whispered. Brian wouldn't admit it out loud, but he was starting to believe David's delusions. Motioning to the inside ladder, David moved first, taking slow steps to avoid tripping, and Brian followed close behind, wiping the beads of nervous sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. A loud creak made them both halt in their tracks. David looked back at Brian, who then looked at his own feet, and lifting his left foot, the board underneath let out a slightly softer groan. Brian mouthed a silent, "Sorry," but by then the damage was done. A hand burst through the floor, grabbing his leg. The sound of bones cracking could be heard, causing Brian to scream in agony. His leg disappeared through the hole, followed by the rest of his body, when the old floorboards gave away underneath him. "Brian!" David called, dropping his flashlight in shock of the moment. He jumped through the hole behind his companion, landing hard and rolling to the side. He turned in time to see the statue slinging Brian towards one of the support beams, but swung his shotgun up and fired. The salted iron buckshot pelted the arm of the stone man, blowing it off mid-swing, and Brian missed the post, landing in the hay. While he scrambled to his hands and knees and to his 870, and then to his feet to shoot his attacker, but was barely able to stand on his busted leg. And having lost an arm, the stone man turned his attention to David, grabbing his gun and wrenching it to the side, forcing David to fire again. The shot blasted a hole in the roof, casting a beam of sunlight in between them. The stone man had knocked David just away in time to not get caught in the light, backing up and around the sun's rays. Brian waited for a better shot but was distracted by falling debris, covering his head to avoid being knocked out. When he looked up, the statue was on him, punching him in the chest with a loud boom. The steel plates in his vest took most of the blow, but he was sent flying and felt a couple of ribs crack. David was getting to his feet by this point, blood dribbling down his chin. He spat a tooth out while stumbling over next to Brian, helping him up the best he could. The stone man's feet thudded on the floor as it strode across the room towards them. "Come on, Brian, let's fuck this bastard up," he said, racking the action of his shotgun and pointing it at the statue. Brian groaned in pain but managed to get up to a knee. The stone man was almost within arm's reach when they both fired at the same time, followed by sporadic firing when one chambered a fresh round faster than the other. Boom, 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 boom. The statue was blasted back with each shot, losing a leg, its other arm, and massive chunks out of its torso, falling back with a hard thud. And once it was down, they stopped shooting. That, and they were out of ammo. David pulled a spare shell from his pocket and loaded it into his gun. And walking over, his face went through all kinds of emotions. Fear at being so close to one of these things, sadness, which turned to anger at what it had done to his brother. Pride in taking it down. Looking down at it, trying to get up, he put his foot on his chest and held it down. This is for Marcus, you evil son of a bitch, he said, bringing up the gun and firing it into its face. The stowman's head shattered from the blast, its body cracking and crumbling under his foot. David spat on the rubble, kicking a few pieces away as he turned to see Brian. "You all right?" he asked, pulling him up to his feet and supporting him on his weak side. "No, I was really looking forward to having you committed," Brian said as they both laughed. It only took a few minutes to think up a clever answer to their injuries. Back at the warehouse, they worked together to turn over one of the tool shelves, causing a domino effect. And that hurt more than anything else, David said, digging through what was once valued as treasures. "So, I tripped, turned over a shelf, got busted up a little, but it landed on you. I helped you out from under the mess and called an ambulance. Sound about right?" he asked, to which Brian just nodded. David went out to the car to use the radio to call for help, and then pulled out his cell to call Gerald with the good news. It rang only a few times before he heard it connect. "Hello?" the old man spoke. "Gerald, I got it. I killed the damn thing," he said with a gleeful excitement. "What'd you say?" Gerald asked. "I said I killed it," David repeated. "It? Don't you mean them?" Gerald asked. "Them?" David inquired. "What do you mean, them?" A confused Gerald came back. You took two of them, didn't you?" Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. Absolutely chest-pounding. What a refreshing storyline there is. Action-packed and a little bit of history and lore there. What a perfect mix to a nightmare-inducing story. Big thank you, James, as always, for your incredible support, brother. Your input is super exciting. I feel very blessed as a narrator to be working with such talents as yourself and Michael G. Lockhart, Edward Ed Smith, and of course, my good friend Wayne Harbison. Cannot wait to see what you write next, and I know you mentioned you have 3 or 4 bubbling in the works at the moment. Well, guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a great week at work, school, studying, or maybe you're a long-distance driver and you just keep hauling on. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and you're keeping fit and focused. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.